remember the book that made you a reader? Sonja, do you want to start, or you're thinking? I can see you thinking. I'm going to
say, I don't know if it's the first. I don't think it's the first book that made me a reader, but I can say that the book that probably left the most indelible impression on me when I was reading was Anne of Green Gables, which is the most cliche thing on the planet. But I didn't come from a tradition of Anne of Green Gables. It was not something my mother would have put in front of me because we immigrated to Canada. And I got it as a 3-book set from a friend. I still have that 3-book set from a friend. And I just fell in love, like with Anne and Prince Edward Island. And that was it. I was hooked and addicted. And then the 80s started and Kevin Sullivan happened.
And then what?
And Kevin Sullivan, the Kevin Sullivan production of hit the TV. But to me, like, that's the one that probably left the most indelible mark as a child, was disappearing into Anne of Green Gables, which again, as I say, is super cliche, but it's not something my mother would ever have put in front of me because she didn't have a can-lit history of any sort.
What was it about it that I mean, obviously you still have the book, so there's something about it. Can you remember what it was?
It was Anne. Honestly, it was Anne. It was the fact that she had this determination to sort of use her imagination at all times, no matter how much anybody tried to quash it down. But she was also always vulnerable. She always wanted people to like her and to love her, even though she was always doing her stuff, right? And so it was just this character who was always getting into trouble, but then always also wanted people to like her at the same time. I guess I just love the fact that she had so much energy as a character.
I have to admit that, so I'm talking about the book that when I was 6 made me love books, but I'm like you, I'm an immigrant, and I had just finished reading Anne when I was 11 years old, and my parents told me we were moving to Canada. And I remember being so shocked that we were going to this place called Ontario, when clearly PEI was the superior choice. And I mean, now being here and never having made it out to PEI, sadly, I know exactly what you mean. And with the I love Anne too, and I think why do we write her off as cliche? Because she was powerful and she's feminist and she refuses to submit to the social conventions of the time. And I think even now, looking because of a child that I am parenting, I'm looking here going, Anne had ADHD too, like totally. She was gifted ADHD, and I'm sitting there going, I don't know, I just. There's lots to talk about, and I think we do her a disservice when we say she's cliche, even though she totally is cliche.
And I think for me, it's not that she is the cliche, but that I'm the cliche for having her as my model. Like that's what is me as the cliche, not her. I don't think she's actually cliche at all, but it's sort of the cliche to like Anne, I guess.
As a Canadian, okay. Yeah. Vanessa, are you an Anne fan, or would you like to take us in a totally different direction?
Honestly, I don't think I ever read Anne of Green Gables, and I didn't read a whole lot of the traditional children's stories or young adult stories when I was growing up. So what made me a reader wasn't so much any particular book, was because I grew up with a father who was a reader. He was an English teacher. He was, sadly, a Hemingway scholar. And so I grew up in a house that looked like a library. There were bookshelves in every room. Even the bathroom had bookshelves in it. So there were always books there, and it was always, 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 always literature, because he was really fascinated by all the great literary titans and all the great literature there was out in the world. So I had a very strange childhood because I was not encouraged to read a lot of the books like Little Women or Anne of Green Gables or all those ones that so many other people list as their favorites from childhood. I remember, going through a period when I was like 8 or 9 years old when I was really into Arthur Miller. And I remember, being really into, of course, I've read everything Hemingway ever wrote, including the unfinished books, including the newspaper articles, including all the criticism of his work. It was a very strange childhood. I think I'd read War and Peace by the time I was 15. And if you did not read War and Peace by the time you were 15, you did not grow up in my father's house. So I think to me, it wasn't so much that reading was something I was passionate about. It was just presented to me as that's the way you live a life. you read and you read, and then you read some more, and you try to stick with the classics because you're going to learn a whole lot more from the classics than you are from anything that you pick up in a dime store. And so it was a very strange childhood. So yeah, so what was my favorite book when I was growing up? Honestly, I'd have to pick something by Charles Dickens, I think, because I really liked Charles Dickens, even from a very young age, had great reading skills. To this day, I don't know how much I actually picked up from those books. It is a very young age to be reading great literature. How much do you actually absorb? And I don't know the answer to that question. But, I know that reading for fun, just throw away books that you read in the afternoon and toss away, it was something I learned as an adult. So, and really just in the last 10 or 20 years, because, for me, reading was always this serious business. So, obviously I have an English degree because it was not optional. So yeah, I had a strange childhood in that way.
So a lot of my questions just went out the window. All right, that's great. I love that. So my question to you is, Vanessa, do you remember the book that taught you that recreational reading was a valid life to have, or are you still not there? I'm wondering, just reading for fun.
It was really fairly recently that I was introduced to the detective books by Louise Penny, and all those Gamache detective novels. And so I don't remember when she first started writing those. It must have been a decade ago or more. So that was really my first introduction. And then somebody said, oh, you should read Linwood Barclay. He's a Canadian who does this in the same genre. And so that was really the first time about a decade ago that I really started reading genre fiction. So I would just throw out those two names as, if you're just, sitting in the backyard, have nothing better to do, they're great reads, great fun for half an hour. And then you move on with the rest of your life.
What about you, Sonja? A recreational read, do you have a go-to genre or a go-to author?
Well, I guess it's different at different times. I mean, I will say, my childhood was all recreational reads, right? So I remember doing the MS Readathon. I don't know if anybody remembers doing the MS Readathon, and you had to read as many books as you could in a month and raise money for MS. And I had read 65 books, and I had read the most books in my school because I just basically consumed my library, right? Chewed it up. And it was all recreational reads. So I don't have an experience of, then I started reading literary fiction. Was a later thing, actually, right? It started as a later, but because it was really consuming. I will say that I'm an absolute fan of Louise Penny. She's on my bookshelf back here. And I love Louise Penny's books. Lately, I hadn't read them before. I started reading Kate Quinn, and I got quite hooked into Kate Quinn's books. Sometimes I have friends, some people who will watch like a TV show, and they'll have the TV on in the evenings, and they'll disappear that way. I disappear into if I need to disappear, I disappear into genre fiction of various sorts, right? So sometimes it's historical fiction, sometimes it's mystery, sometimes it's suspense, and sometimes I don't even need to know who the characters' names are at the end. I don't need to. I just needed to disappear for a couple of hours. And that couple of hours was bliss, to just disappear and not think about anything else and just disappear into that world and then come back out of it. Right. But with the Louise Penny's there, I have to say, I have an affection for all the characters, especially after several books. I care about them. I want to know what happens in their lives.
Exactly.
It is. It's sometimes when you leave a book, it feels like you're losing a friend.
Mm-hmm.
And that's so speaking of friends, is there a book that you choose to reread for that friendship, or perhaps because you really admire that particular author's craft? Vanessa.
Yeah, that's a challenging question. So as a general rule, I don't reread books. And, this is something I got from my father as well. It's rereading a book, it was your favorite book at a specific time, but as you move on a year later, 2 years later, you're at a different point in your life. So you may have thought it was the best book ever when you read it at 18 or at 30, but you're at a different place in your life. And so it's sort of like going back to a place you used to live, right? You have these memories and it's this one thing, but then when you go back to it, it's not really what you remembered it to be. So as a general rule, I don't reread books. So in terms of, books that I found really inspirational, I can remember the first time I read a book by Michael Ondaatje. That was called, first one I read, I think was called The Skin of a Lion. I have to remember that. And the second one was Coming Through Slaughter. And those are books that I don't reread them, but they sit very high in my memory because they showed me possibilities that I didn't realize were there. You learn writing in school, in high school, and in university. You sort of get it down. You get the whole drill down, and you know how writing goes, and you know how to construct sentences and paragraphs. But he was such a strong poetic writer that it opened my mind up to possibilities that I didn't even really know were there, that I could really go anywhere where I'm writing. I can just do anything. I don't have to worry about what the rules are. I can write in a totally different way. So that's really what he taught me with those books. Have not gone back to reread them. I think about going back to reread them, particularly Coming Through Slaughter, because I remember just what a strong impact that had on me. But I have this fear that if I go back and reread them, that it's not going to have the impact that it had. And I need that impact there, that idea that writing can be magical and it can be anything that I want it to be. So I don't want to, ruin it by going back there and taking away some of that magic for myself.
Wonderful answer. Sonja, what about you?
It's interesting because your point about not wanting to reread books again. The one book that I remember reading in high school, and then when I was forced to read it, and then having to be reforced to read it. I had to read Wuthering Heights in high school, which I despised because I remember, and all my friends were like, "But Heathcliff, he's so romantic," and I was just like. Anyway, so then it came on to this I had interviewed for a liberal studies program at SFU, and they gave me a list of the possible books and said, "Have you read any of these?" And one of them was Wuthering Heights, and I said, "Yeah." I noticed a couple others that I'd read. I said, "I've read Wuthering Heights," and one of the interviewers said, "Well, what do you think of it?" And I said, "Honestly, they whinge too much. They just whinge all the time." And I realized afterwards, I didn't know what the person that asked me the question was someone who taught sort of romantic and Victorian literature. And I was just walked right over her favorite stuff. Anyway, I read it again and I still thought they whinged and I still didn't like it. So in that sense, my experience was very similar over the two rereads. That said, I do read, and this was actually something I picked up from a friend who does it all the time. She goes every summer and she reads all the Louise Penny books in a row every summer, all however many of them there are at the moment. There's a new one coming out in August, which I have not yet pre-ordered. But so I have gone back and read them a number of times, but not in the order they were written, which horrifies my friend. But just to see what it is to go back and read it again. What do I see differently the second time I read it, or even the third time I read it? How is it different? How is that experience different? Not just of reading it, but also questions of craft, because of course, as you start, when you write your first book and you move further up, there are differences, right? So what's the difference between the books that she's writing like 5 years ago versus the ones she's writing now versus 10 years ago? They're very different sorts of things. And so I do that kind of thing. And of course, if I'm going to go back to my Ellen Montgomery fixation, The Blue Castle, I have read that. I can't even count how many times I've read The Blue Castle. So I have this edition from the 1970s I picked up at a thrift store with his totally psychedelic cover. And I can't tell you how many times I've read that same copy.
I've not read that one. And that's her one adult read, isn't it?
It is an adult read. Absolutely. Yeah.
I've got to look at that. One of the interesting things I found is that, as we talk about the canon, I love books that do, I mean, very postmodern conceit that flip. So, I mean, I never read Moby Dick and I know I can't, I won't, but there was a great book called Ahab's Wife that takes his wife, who I think is mentioned like 4 pages in the book, and it builds a whole story around her. And then Wuthering Heights, like you, I absolutely detested. But I really liked Here on Earth and I just had the author's name, and then of course it just fleetingly left me, which was another rewrite, but Catherine was a lot less annoying and Heathcliff was a lot more human. You know, I'm just like the Moors, like, shut up. I don't care. You're all weathering. Shut up. It's what I felt about you, Wuthering Heights. It was anyway. So has the pandemic affected your reading?
Yes.
At all?
Yeah.
Okay, so we got a yes from both of you. Would either of you care to elaborate? Sonja, can we go in inverse order this time?
For me, one of the things that I have found is I don't have, apart from, in my work, of course, I'm reading a lot, but for sort of leisure reads, I have less capacity for literary fiction because it demands more of me. And I just don't have, with, family, et cetera, work, et cetera, all that, everything else brewing around. I just don't have the emotional and intellectual capacity in my free time to do a lot of literary fiction because it asks more of me, and it should. And so I have found myself doing a lot more just generic e-reads from the library, where I could sit down and find for you what books they were, but I couldn't remember the titles of, right? So, but that is some of those things I just need to escape and get away, right? But the things that require me to think more, I just don't have the oomph for it to do much of that. That's the big change, I think, for me.
And you found that so that's been consistent and is consistent to this moment.
It's getting a bit better now, but it's still like I would do much more of the literary fiction reading, and I would do the other stuff would appear in like late November when things got hairy at work, and all the term papers and everything start coming in. But now all the other stuff is the main, and the literary fiction pops up. So.
And have you flipped forms at all? Like I like picked up audio reading versus print, or are you
One thing I've done more of is poetry, actually, which is odd because again that also demands more, but perhaps because it's more contained, and it doesn't require. It requires a focused attention for a shorter period of time than a whole, say, novel would, where I have to commit for much longer at that level. Whereas I can pick up a book of poetry and read a poem and be with that poem for a while. And it sits with me for a while, but I don't have to carry that through for a few weeks at a time.
Vanessa, we've said yes too. What have your experiences been?
Yeah, so I'm definitely with Sonja on that one. I think, the pandemic hit, and first it was alarm, and it just seemed an extended period of alarm. And then after that, as it just dragged on and on and on, it was depression and deeper depression. And I found that reading just went right out the window. I couldn't concentrate for longer than a few minutes. And I really didn't want, and Sonja said, I really didn't want to really challenge my brain in any meaningful way. So for me, it was Netflix. It's been Netflix for like a year and a half of just zoning out. It's bright, it's colorful. You don't have to think too hard about it. Hours go by before you go back and remember that there's a pandemic going on. So yeah, in terms of reading, I think over the past year, let's say I've read maybe 20 books for recreation, which is significantly down from what I would normally read. But yeah, and a lot of them were audiobooks. Louise Penny's available on audiobook, so her latest one came out a few months ago, got that one immediately. So a lot of audiobooks where I didn't have to read and challenge myself. So that's really been for me what the pandemic's been about, is it's just so depressing that, it was just show me something shiny that I'm going to forget in 5 minutes, but it's going to distract me. I'm not going to think about all the badness out there in the world. And now that it's starting to wind down, I think it's winding down better in many parts of the country than it is in British Columbia, like in southeastern British Columbia, where we have never-ending drought. We have shocking heat waves going up to 41 degrees, which I never thought we would see in Canada. We've had just endless wildfires. This is going to go down as the worst wildfire season in history. So the smoke is socked in the valleys. So, I'm still hoping to get out the other side. It was like, oh, great, we're all getting vaccinated. We're going to get out the other side. This summer's going to be great. And now it's, well, I hope sometime in the next month, the smoke goes down, and I hope the heat goes down the next month, and then I'm going to come out of it. But I have actually started downloading books onto my iPad so that in preparation, knowing that, okay, the sense that this is soon going to be over is there. and my brain is starting to turn back on. And I've totally watched absolutely everything on Netflix, including many things that I probably shouldn't have and didn't really want to, but they were shiny, and so the reader in me has come back up, after a year and a half of, terror and depression.
Yeah, I understand all of these things and agree. So one of the things that I've struggled with, and so I guess this is my next question is, as I'm sure Canadian authors, I know Canadian authors, there are people who have released during this pandemic, and I have felt horrible. I bought their books, but I have not read them. And, so these to be read piles are just getting, deeper and higher and deeper. And so I guess the question is, do you feel the same way? And B, how are you supporting your friends and other Canadian writers in this time, especially when you're struggling reading?
Well, doing this for sure. So I was one of those unfortunate writers who had a book published in 2020. It was supposed to be published in April, but of course, Amazon at that time shut down. It wasn't shipping books. It was only shipping necessities. And so publishing then was not a possibility. So the deadline got pushed back and it was published in August. But honestly, I think like a lot of writers who were published in 2020, it just felt like your book got tossed into a void somewhere, and it was just an extremely frustrating experience to have that happen. So mostly, I spent a lot of the time last year just trying to come up with like online events or things that I could do so that I could just have my name out there. Because normally I do what everybody else does, which goes around to all the local libraries in particular and do readings there and do all of that stuff. And that was no longer on the table. So, trying to find some way to do sort of online book tours was something that I was trying to do. And in terms of supporting, other writers, whenever the opportunity comes up, that's exactly what I do. So, for instance, what we're doing here today, a publisher did this, you're doing this. A couple of libraries came up with the idea of why don't we do this? And just trying to, just support. So, Sonja's a writer. She writes books. Go out and buy her books, and just raise the awareness that we are still here. We do exist. And unfortunately, I think maybe young adult or children's authors made out a little bit better because it seems like people continue to read those kinds of books. But those of us who are writing literature, I think people did exactly what Sonja and I did. It's just too hard. It's too challenging. And so you just do what you can do, the best that you can do, which is just whenever the opportunity comes up to support somebody. The other thing I've been doing, and I've been encouraging other people to do this, is writing reviews when I read a book. I think it's one of the big complaints that so many of us writers have is nobody ever reviews our books. Like, it's always nice when you get reviewed by, a literary magazine or Quill and Choir or something like that. But it's just as valuable, and I'm speaking as a reader here, it's just as valuable when the regular ordinary readers go out to like Amazon or something and put their comments underneath your book. Because when I'm going out to buy books, I always read them. I want to see what the top, for it comments are, and I want to see what the top negative comments are against it. And so that's one thing I've been doing, and I've been doing that more this year than any other year, is the one thing I can do is whenever I read a book is just go out and review it. Just a short paragraph here or there on whatever I can think of to put it on. So Goodreads, I'll often put it on Amazon. I'll put it on Apple Books. And just make sure that people are aware that these writers are out there. They're writing good books. Most of the books I read are small press, and those are the ones who tend to get the least reviews. They tend to get the least notice from awards juries. And so, that's what I go out there and do is just, I'm going to review every book I read. I've committed myself to do that from now on, just so people can, so that when people wander across their book and stumble across their book on Amazon and think, should I buy this? Well, it's got a couple of good reviews here. So yeah, I should. Yeah.
And I think your point about the small presses is really important too, because if we're going to continue to have a vibrant literary landscape here in Canada, it can't just be the big publishing houses, especially as they seem to keep swallowing each other up into becoming one big publishing house. So these smaller presses are so important for the diversity and breadth of Canadian writing.
Right. And of course, the large presses have the budgets to go out with the advertising. They have the budgets to have publicity people always putting their books in front of awards juries, in front of people who do reviews. So, and that's something that small presses just don't have. Both of the small presses that I've published on, I think they have part-time people doing publicity and press for them. And that's not really even enough for one author, let alone their entire slate of authors. And that's just the world that we live in is that, over the years that I've been writing, decades that I've been writing, the amount of budget that's devoted to publicity in small presses has gone down. They're not making a whole lot of money. They're sort of being squeezed off to the side while everybody buys their books from these larger companies that can advertise. And so, yeah, you're seeing that they just don't have the resources to compete against these big mega things. And of course, a lot of these big mega things, as you say, are getting more and more mega. So they've got international money behind them that they can use to go out and advertise. And so a lot of people who are publishing on small presses, their books just don't ever get seen by anybody. And a lot of them are just absolutely fabulous books. I mean, some of my favorite books are coming off small presses. And I know that I'm one of like 1,000 people who are going to read that book, whereas a book that's maybe not as good that comes out from a major publisher is going to get tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of readers. And something about that strikes me as the universe is a little bit unfair. But the only thing I can really do about that as an individual person is just go out and review and try to make sure that I'm giving people who are not familiar with small press writers a reason to read their work.
Sonja, do you have anything to add to that those observations and thoughts as we're all sitting here going, yes?
No, I mean, I think Vanessa's comments there is spot on. So much stuff there in terms of supporting other writers and so on. That's super valuable. I think the one thing that I can do, because I teach at a university, is I can program writers. Like I can program books. And so that brings it into a classroom. And then more students will read it that way, who then often, especially if it's a novel or say a memoir, they then if they would like it, they get it as a present for their mom or their sister or their brother or whoever, or somebody else that they know will get it for Christmas or whatever, right? So, or a birthday or something like that. I do think that there's a lot of value in the whole word of mouth thing too. So Vanessa said, you write little reviews. I quite regularly will post on Facebook or Twitter if I really like something, because it's just it's a small thing, but I do it for other people. I read this cool book that leads me to another cool book, right? That I maybe didn't read, but they mention it, and that makes me go poke at it and see what looks interesting, right? So that happened earlier. What was the book called again? Tracy Chevalier's book on Mary Anning. Is it Beautiful Creatures or something like that? Anyway, it was a novel that came out, and that colleague of mine had read it, and then I was like, oh, that looks super interesting. And I want to read about Mary Anning, about histories of paleontology in a novel form. I'll go read it. And then I pass that on to someone else, right? And so the same thing you can do with any book that I read that I really like. Most lately, it was Michelle Good's Five Little Indians. And then I pass that on to other people, right? So, because I think the word of mouth does make a difference for people as you go through. But I sympathize a lot for people releasing books last year, because all the conventional stuff that goes along with the materiality of a new book is just gone, right? Like it's all floating around in the ether somewhere. And I can't even imagine it, that you're missing all that sort of the hands-on face-to-face-ishness of new bookishness, if that makes any sense, is just gone, right? And it's like the bottom drops out of it in some ways. And that's a hard thing to imagine. So I am lucky enough that I have a good enough job that I buy a lot of books. So that I figure one way that I can support is I buy books, and to make sure that they're then part, rather than only, I think libraries are fantastic, but I think if I can buy books, then I should buy books, because that's one way that I can also, that supports an author, but it supports a small press. It supports a larger picture as well. And if I can do that, why not do that? So that's another way that I would support writers. I haven't written reviews on Amazon at all myself, I have to say. It's not something I've done.
That's okay. I haven't written anything on Facebook, so there you go.
There you go. Well, see, then we should pair up, right? And then cross-pollinate.
And my chosen app, I'm not fond of Goodreads, I have to admit. So the chosen app that I've been using for all this time, and I loved it because you put your little review in, and then it would say, do you want to tweet it? And you just press one button and out it goes into Twitter. And it was, again, a pretty seamless transition. And they announced they're closing at the end of this year. They are attached to a large publishing house, but they didn't just have their books. And I really liked it because it was very visual. And like I said, you could immediately put it out on Twitter, and it's disappearing, which makes me very sad. So the last question I have, and you kind of headed there for me, Sonja, thank you, was it's a two-parter. It's, what do you think specifically Canadian authors have to offer the world? And any that you've really, even though we didn't read as much as we have, and even though we're not reading literary fiction the way we have been, 2 or 3 titles that really have resonated with you in the last year, 2 years.
So if I would say, what do Canadian authors have to offer? I think one thing is, I mean, we live in a specific place, in a specific time with specific histories and so on. And I think that inevitably, no matter who you are, all of that is going to shape your writing in very specific ways, right? If I had grown up in the United States, or if I'd grown up, I don't know, wherever else, Portugal or wherever else, Japan, my writing would be different because that context would be so different, right? It would be a very different sort of thing. There has been an explosion of fantastic Indigenous writing here that has been so rich, so vibrant, so moving. And I think that is a particular contribution from this particular place and these particular histories, however they have, and the impact is both positive and negative, right? You can never say that I'm not saying that everything is good about what we export, where we live, because a lot of it has been violent and traumatic in many, many ways. But I think thinking about the context in which we emerge shapes the writing in very distinct sorts of ways. If I had to pick a couple of books that came out in the last couple of years, Canadian books, I would go back to Five Little Indians. Michelle Good's book came out very recently, over last year. And what I loved, and it's hard to say you love that book because there's so much violence embedded in it. But so I think love is it's like having those stupid hearts for everything. Can we just have a star instead of a heart or something? But what it is because it is what struck me so strongly in that book was the everydayness of violence and how it's there and embedded everywhere. And it's not sensationalized in any way, shape, or form. And yet it is more brutal because of that. And also at the same time, you have 5 characters who have been impacted by similar histories, but their lives end up in different directions, and sometimes almost at the drop of a hat, just a little turn here, and it turns like there's an odd arbitrariness to it too, that also is heartbreaking at the same time, right? So what I found was that it was told in such a very matter-of-fact, straightforward sort of way, nothing sensational about it at all. And yet that was what was devastating about its impact when I was reading it, was that the matter-of-factness to it. And then the other book that I would mention that I read just a few months ago was Christianne Conlon's The Speed of Mercy. And for me, that book really stuck out for me because of the 2 main characters, Stella and Diane, because these are 2 women, middle-aged and elderly women, and both in a care home, one of whom has been traumatized so deeply that she can't access certain memories in certain ways. And these are characters you never see as agents and protagonists of their own stories ever in novels, right? You see them on the edges somewhere. You see them in a background somewhere. You see them as little cardboard cutouts somewhere. And in this case, they're the center and the heart of the story. These women who are aging women, one's aging, one's elderly, women who are dealing with mental and physical challenges in various sorts of ways, with mental health issues. And yet they are fully developed, fully realized. There's nothing stereotypical about them. There's nothing reductive about them. they are full agents of their own stories with their own histories, their own feelings, their full emotions, and so on. So for me, that was just important. I mean, it was an amazing book to read, but I think what made it amazing for me was partly these characters that you never see. You never see characters like this in novels.
That's The Speed of Mercy, you said?
The Speed of Mercy.
The Speed of Mercy and Five Little Indians. I have that.
Time earlier, I can't remember, a few months ago, something like that.
Time is so fluid.
I know, time is sometime earlier this year it came out. And it's actually located, the present day of it is located during the pandemic. So it must have been very recent.
Oh, okay. So it acknowledges that. That's
acknowledges the pandemic. Yeah. And then it's located in the Annapolis Valley, Nova Scotia. And it's a very alive landscape as well. But for me, it's the characters in that book.
So Vanessa, I had a history prof in university that talked about Canada shouldn't be one country, it should be 5 countries. And so one of the other questions I'd slated was, because we have such interesting regionalization in this group, I was wondering if, the West Coast versus East Coast had different flavors to the writing, but I don't think we have time for that. So Vanessa, what do you think Canadian authors can offer the world, and your top picks or recommendations of Canadian authors you've read recently?
Yeah, well, I'm going to have to agree with Sonja here. I think our Indigenous writing is a gift to the world. And we've had so much of it come out really just in the past decade. It was a trickle before that, and then it's just the floodgates open, and we've got so much of it. I remember taking a course in Native American and Canadian literature back when I was in university, and I won't say how many years ago that was, but being opened up to these different cultures that were embedded in our own culture and operating differently. They think differently. They view the world very differently. And I just thought, it's a shame that we don't have very much of it at that time. And this was, we'll say 30 years ago, and be kind. But now we're getting so much of it. And Indigenous culture isn't one thing, it's multiple cultures. And so every single culture throughout the country, the many dozens of cultures, they've all got this tradition, this oral tradition that is now being written down, and they're telling their own stories in just a phenomenal way. I think when I read The Marrow Thieves a few years ago, I think I gave that book to absolutely everybody. This is the best book ever. Just go read this book. We should be teaching this in school. There are so many jumping off points in that one book.
Just so you know, we do teach it at my school, and the sequel's coming out this fall.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, it's just every Canadian should just, if you could just have one book, just read that one book, because of all the different things you can tease out of it. It's just an amazing book. And so I would agree with that on the Indigenous literature. And in general, I would say diversity. Because we are a very diverse country, people have come here from all countries around the world. I mean, there's 3 of us on this call here, 2 of whom are immigrants, right? From immigrant traditions. And the fact that we've managed to do that, admittedly imperfectly, but the fact that we have allowed people to come to this country to retain their own cultures, that we are getting more and more open to alternative lifestyles, so LGBT communities, Black Lives Matters coming up. We've got all of these things happening in country. There are many countries in the world where those things are not allowed to exist. They're not allowed to thrive. And so the fact that we have sort of a loose framework in this country that allows diversity to flourish, and again, I'll say imperfectly, because I think we get a lot of things wrong traditionally and continuing to this day. And I think there's a huge amount of work that we need to do to get more voices out there and to reduce the traditional harm that's being done in this country to a lot of marginalized communities. But I think the fact that we have a country in which they can, come out and speak, their stories in their ways, we're getting a whole lot of more originality and a whole lot of more creativity and a much bigger window on the world than we had in Canadian literature even 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. I mean, it is just exploding in what I think is a magnificent way that is going to be a benefit to the world. Yeah.
2 or 3 titles?
Well, I just said The Marrow Thieves, and I'm just trying to think because I honestly have not read very much. So when we talk about the books that I've read in the last year, that sad little 20 books that I read over the sad year, some of the ones that really touched me, I read The Glass Hotel by Emily St. John Mandel, and I had read her first book, which I think was her first book, was Station 11. Station 11 is actually a great book for a pandemic, right? Because it actually brings you to the world if the pandemic had gone a much different way than it did for us now. So these characters who start in the pandemic, and then you see the result and how quickly society breaks down and what happens when society breaks down. I thought that was very good. And actually, I'm thinking of Marrow Thieves. It's kind of a pandemic related thing as well as too. I mean, what happens there? So those are great books. So her latest book was The Glass Hotel, which again, I think it was nominated for a Giller Prize and should have been. I think she's an absolutely fabulous imaginative writer. Certainly The Outlander was another one I read this year. And I think that book's a few years old. It's by Jill Admonson. And that's actually set around here, which is why I picked it up, right? One of the things about living in the Kootenays is it's an area that hasn't traditionally had a whole lot of writers. So it's an area that hasn't traditionally had a whole lot written about it in a creative way. And so that was one of the things that I really liked about that book, is that there was a slide here that happened, a rock slide. Half of a mountain fell down. And that's actually part of this book. And I just thought it was interesting, the characters. And I got to say, she wrote with a creativity in the creation of her characters, and especially in the way they spoke, that I was just completely jealous of when I read it. And I just thought, oh, wow, I wish I could have, done that. And I was also, because my recent book, the one that got tossed into the void during the pandemic, The High Eaters, was set on Manitoulin Island back in 1877. So I was really admired the research that she did, because there's so much research that goes into writing a historical novel. 90% of it, which ends up getting thrown out. All it basically does is it puts you in the right context, so you don't make silly errors like have people speak using language that they wouldn't use now, or using technology that they didn't have back then. If you're writing a story about Manitoulin Island back in 1877, you better not have a telephone in it. Those things didn't exist back then. Certainly not in the rural communities. And so, it was one of those things that I just read, and I thought, that's an example of how to write a historical novel and to really just nail it. Because she really did nail it. And another one that I read was something called The Dying Detective. And that's a book, detective tells you what genre it is in, but it's not really in a detective genre so much as it's literary. I think it's one of the very few literary detective novels that I've ever read. It was written by Gerald Lynch. And what I really liked about it was how challenging it was. I was talking earlier about reading, Louise Penny books or Linwood Barclay, which is something you read in a few hours and, just chuck, and you sort of, to some extent, I'll say you forget about it. But, like Sonja, the world of, the Inspector Ganache and all that stuff, it kind of sticks with you. But, this one, because it was a very challenging book, deliberately challenging in the ideas he explored, and it's set in the near future. And it was, it was one of those things where, yes, on one hand, it is a detective novel, and he's doing all the things that basically detectives do in these kind of novels. But because it was exploring really challenging themes, and it was exploring really challenging personalities, that when you get to the end of it, it sticks with you in a way that detective books typically don't. So I would actually put it more in the literature category. So unfortunately, I think he probably doesn't sell as many books as Louise Penny does. Who does really? But, I wrote a review on it, everywhere, just because it's like, get out and read this. If you like detective books, and you like literature, this is a merging of the two things in a way that will keep your brain operating, fulfill that stuff that we get out of literature, which is why we read so much of it. And enjoyable at the same time.